meeting of the Welcome to the July monthly meeting of the Boston chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Tonight, we're very excited to have Katsyris Rivera-Kientz, who's a Ph.D. student in sociology at UMass in Boston. She's an environmental sociologist studying the dynamic relationship between society and the built and natural environment, including issues of systemic inequality, climate-related disparities, and preparedness for climate hazards. Current research includes capturing climate change public opinion among ethnic and racial minorities in Greater Boston, and examination of the involvement of transient populations in climate resilience planning and policies. And tonight, very excited to have Katsy talk with us about racial, environmental, and climate justice. So welcome, Katsy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Gary, Matt, and Craig, and especially CCL, the Boston chapter, for having me. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so hi, everyone. My name is Katsyris Rivera-Kientz. I am a graduate student in sociology and a research fellow at the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. As a sociologist, I look at the structures of society that open the way to contemporary environmental and climatic issues. And my goal today are to guide you through a series of historical events that have shaped our system, thus affecting the outcomes of the relationship between nature and society. So in this presentation, racial, environmental, and climate justice, I want us to think about environmental justice as a process. I'm mentioning my professor, Dr. Estrada Martinez, because we've been working along together in this topic. So now let's start with the concept of race. As we all know, race has been discussed in policies on education, community policing, labor, among others. And even though the topic has been trending lately, race has always been key to understanding our contemporary society. So today I will examine the role of race in environmental justice and climate change. First, let's start mentioning that race is not biological. Race is not biological. In fact, biological or genetic differences across human races are very small, and these are mostly correlated with geography. Now, what race is a social construct. It is a human-invented classification system that was put in place to define physical and cultural characteristics. In the United States, the classification system was used to justify the oppression and violence that European settlers used against African and indigenous peoples. So, and European settlers wanted to expand their power and preserve their economy, and to do so, they stole the lives and labor of Black people and the lands that belong to Native American nations. So to reconcile these actions with the ideas of democracy and equality, they needed to convince themselves that these other groups, people of color, were not only different, but inferior and less humans. So with the concept of race, they could use visible phenotype characteristics in ancestry to justify the classification and systems of violence and oppression. Whereas the highest value was given to whiteness, and this became the foundation of many other social systems. Now, let's discuss structural racism, which refers to all the ways in which societies foster and perpetuate racial discrimination. Structural racism consists of multiple systems, many of which were designed to cater to the needs of white people, and in many instances, purposefully push back other groups, non-white groups. For example, some of the systems are housing policies, education, labor market, social safety nets, tax policies, social networks, etc. And what us social scientists and economists have found is that historically, these systems have been reinforcing each other and continue to replicate discriminatory beliefs, values, and unequal distribution of resources. As we narrow the scope, we find institutional racism, which falls within the bigger category of structural racism. Institutional racism are policies and practices that are carried out by the government and private entities that have discriminatory effects on the basis of racialized group membership. Some of these have been explicitly put in place to maintain racial hierarchy, whilst other they have not been explicit. So for example, during the Jim Crow era, discrimination was legal and segregation was enforced in almost every aspect of US society. It played out in public spaces, public schools, public transportation, restrooms, restaurants, drinking fountains, and more. A second example of institutional racism is the Social Security Act, which explicitly excluded farmers and domestic servants, which were the primary jobs that Black Americans had in 1935. And it was a way to get the Southern Democrats to sign on to the bill. This meant that Black men and women could not afford to retire and had to depend on their children instead of leaving assets to their children, which is what many white families could do. A third example would be the Civil Rights Act, which had a long-term effect after the passing of the laws. Many people in the US thought and still think that racism is a thing of the past because of the laws that upheld slavery. And however, this doesn't see the long reach of these policies or how their effects were transferred to colorblind policies. The next example would be the war on drugs. Started by Richard Nixon, it targeted Black and Latinx neighborhoods, spurred tactics like stop and frisk that targeted Black and brown men, and it included more severe punishments for use and possession of crack or cocaine instead of powder cocaine, even though it's the same drug, except that the powder form was already caught and processed. And we know for each type of drug, what population usually consumes it. And the last example would be the redlining. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration initiated a practice by which they would color code maps with red lines to delineate neighborhoods where mortgages were denied to people of color. So the idea was to steer them away from white neighborhoods. And it was until the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that the practice became illegal, and it took other forms of legislation to begin to dismantle the redlining. So as an effect of the previous forms of institutional racism, we have environmental racism, or the practice of racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of laws and regulations, the deliberate targeting of communities of color with toxic waste facilities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership in ecology and climate movements. So what makes it environmental racism is the outcomes it causes, rather than any malicious intent. The communities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color have systematically been placed closer to hazards. Regulations are often ignored, as was the case most of us know in Flint. And there are fewer trees, for example, there are fewer trees, biodiversity, and poorer air quality in general. So as scientists gathered evidence of disproportionate exposure to hazards and other environmental injustices, the environmental justice efforts started emerging in 1960s. And what is environmental justice? It is the regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions that allow communities to engage in a safe, nurturing, and productive environment. It includes adequate housing and healthcare, decent paying, safe jobs, education of quality, access to recreation, democratic decision-making, and healthy communities free of violence, drugs, and poverty. The environmental justice movement gained momentum in 1980s when the civil rights leaders of color with previous experience advocating for many issues, including the rights of African Americans, the anti-Vietnam War movement, police brutality, and racism in housing and education, these leaders started organizing to address environmental racism. And so communities of color had been bearing with disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards. So the social and economic structure that produced segregation and other racial oppressions was also reproducing environmental injustices. So to give you an example, some of the groups that had been organizing around environmental justice include, first, the Native American struggle for environmental exploitation and self-determination in land use since the European invasion more than 500 years ago. The United Farm Workers fight against pesticide poisoning in the workplace in the 60s. The African American student protest over the drowning of a girl in a garbage dump in Houston in 1967. The Memphis striking garbage workers in 1968, and the fight against toxic waste in North Carolina in 1982, mostly by African Americans. So far, we've discussed race, structural, institutional, and environmental racism. And I introduced environmental justice, and now we're gonna explore one of the outcomes, health. Institutionalized racism has been key to reinforcing segregation and other discriminatory policies that have mostly endangered communities of color. And so environmental hazards are more prevalent. We've seen that in non-white communities, causing disproportionate health outcomes across society. And as you can see in these boxes, exposure to environmental hazards affect place, which includes the social, built, and natural environments that individuals, families, and communities are exposed to. And then place shapes our health through differential exposures to environmental pollutants, high quality foods, safe parks and sidewalks, efficient and accessible transportation systems, high quality schools, housing stock, public and private services, among many others. So there are distinctive geographic patterns to health outcomes, such as life expectancy, cardiovascular disease, cancer, mood disorder, risky health behaviors. And so residents of neighborhoods primarily made up by people of color are more likely to experience poor health and early death. We see the health consequences of this today, where non-Hispanic white communities have a better health profile than communities of color. Now, let's see what happens when we add climate change to the equation. Climate change adds a layer of complexity to the environmental justice issue. And as I said, climate change is an environmental justice issue and will remain being one as long as decision makers and society continues shelving the issue. As you can see in this figure, climate change impacts include rising temperatures, extreme weather, rising sea levels, increased carbon levels, which this lead to extreme heat, air pollution, water and food supply impact, and more. Therefore, climate change impacts cause a wide range of health outcomes, as you can see in the outer layer of the image. You can see the most significant effects on exposure and the subsequent health outcomes that can result from these changes in exposure. When it comes to health, access to healthcare is crucial. But what happens when healthcare is not accessible and or discriminates against certain communities? So circling back to our deeply racialized social structure, there are many thousands of examples of atrocious, unapologetic racism in medicine and public health over the last century or so. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll mention two. First one is James Marion. He advanced knowledge on obstructed childbirth and invented the speculum, which is used in every routine examination on females. However, he did this, all of his research using enslaved Black women without their consent or anesthesia, which already was available. And like many of his time and doctors currently, that he believed that Blacks didn't feel pain in the same way that whites did, and that their inferior intelligence made them perfect candidates for this type of experimentation. Important to note that a similar logic was at play during Nazi's experiments in the death camps of World War II. Second example would be the birth control trials in Puerto Rico. The contraceptives clinic trials at the population level could not be done in the US because of laws that forbade them. So researchers went to Puerto Rico, where they proceeded with little bench research, giving women extremely high doses that had serious adverse health effects. They also started a massive sterilization campaign that lasted until the 1970s in Puerto Rico. And so racism in healthcare looks different now, but it's there. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are more likely to not have health insurance than whites, especially as insurance is tied to employment. People of color are more likely to be unemployed, underemployed, or work in fields that do not have benefits, or jobs where taking time off to go to the doctor or just being sick puts them at risk for losing their employment. And this has been evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. So minority neighborhoods are also more likely to have inadequate healthcare facilities. And I'm now speaking from a place and space perspective. For example, they have underfunded, understaffed urgent care centers, not many primary healthcare providers or specialists, or fully equipped hospitals in their area. So minorities are forced to go to other areas of their city, or even go outside of their city to find care, which delays care and can be vital in many scenarios. There's also a lot of evidence on the quality of the interactions between patients and the medical system, including providers. For example, providers not believing patients, especially their self-assessment of overall health and pain, and not providing adequate care, which has led to not prescribing appropriate medications, not admitting patients to hospitals on time, which ultimately cause excess deaths. And lastly, food insecurity, which is strongly tied to climate change and health. As with healthcare services, the racialized spatial concentration of resources had also resulted in dramatic food insecurity among Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Even before the pandemic, close to 30% of children of color live in households that experience food insecurity. And this, of course, has only gotten worse in the last year. And so the primary reasons for food insecurity are the cost of food. We see that nutritious foods are expensive. Fresh produce is expensive and it requires time and effort to make into meals, and time is money. The locations of supermarkets in many parts of the country, there are no full service supermarkets for many miles, and it's too difficult for people to get to them. And so in many communities of color with full service supermarkets, their fresh produce and meats are probably lower quality and than in primarily white neighborhoods. COVID-19 caused many families to lose their jobs, thus something as basic as feeding themselves became a struggle during the pandemic. And if we add climate change in the equation, extreme weather plays a detrimental role in agriculture. Therefore, food production will be impacted. Food insecurity, health, and access to healthcare services are examples of the outcomes of institutional racism being reflected in environmental inequality. Too often, people tend to think about climate change and society as unrelated, and of climate change as something that will probably happen in the future, despite the multiple climate adaptation and mitigation efforts by the government and the private sector. These efforts are not necessarily considering the concepts I just discussed. Thus, these have been reproducing inequalities within the efforts to address climate change. So I want to leave with there's pressing need to develop climate change adaptation and mitigation measures using a social justice perspective, because evidence shows that current policies are just causing disparate burden across society. For example, exposing people of color to higher environmental health and hazards than whites. And as you have seen in the progress of this presentation, the problem at stake is much more complex and involves labor rights, land use, gender, colonialism, health, race, and more. Therefore, slowing down climate change should consider all these in order to achieve environmental and climate justice. And I would add, should consider all this and more, because of course, in the 20 minutes presentation, I can't cover all of that. But thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Katsy, thank you. That was wonderful. Very thorough, great overview for everybody, I feel. I think we have time for maybe one question if anybody has one.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very both interesting, but also I found myself thinking sometimes the CCL likes to say we're betting the bank on relationships. And as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking of there's so many factors involved in your research. But I was wondering if there was anything in part of your research or your mission to help highlight when we talk about climate change or when we talk about carbon pricing, that would help get that kind of message across in a better, more informed way.
So thank you for your question, Yannick.
Yeah.
I would say that, so I've been conducting focus groups with different groups from different ethnic communities here in Boston, Native Americans, Latinos, Black Americans. And so some of the things that have been striking in these conversations are that the criticism that people think it's going to happen in the future, but climate change is knocking on our doors right now. So kind of stressing the currency, the impact is here. people are suffering. There's people in the Caribbean who are just, and I say this as a Puerto Rican that lived and have family in Puerto Rico. After Hurricane Maria, people have very bad PTSD, right? We joke about it, but so climate change effects are here, and it's now or never. I would say that's pressing that it's the pressing need to act now. That would help. Not sure if I answered your
Thank
question.
you. Yeah.
Katsy, thank you very much again.
Thank you for
Great
having me.
talk, and we'll be talking in the future. And as I mentioned, please feel welcome to stay for as much of the call as you can to learn a little bit more about us.